Okay, well, welcome to the Tom, Stu and You podcast, episode 43. My name is Robin Clapp, and I am a member of the Socialist Party of England and Wales and sit on the National Committee of that party.
Nice. Thank you, Robin. Nice to have you. Nice to have you on the podcast, and thank you for taking the time to come on and discuss socialism with us. It's something that we want to try and get better at on the podcast, is have people on who know more than we do and can present their ideas better than we can, although we do try. So we're hoping today that today can be kind of like an introduction to socialism, maybe some aspects of Marx and what he thought. I know that that's hard to synthesize into a short space of time, but I guess we'll just start with what is your working experience and political experience, and how did you start off getting involved in socialism?
I first became a socialist whilst at school, and what brought me to socialism was seeing the recession in the 1970s, which was a very widespread and international breakdown in trade and a big increase in unemployment. And it affected my own family and my father, who I'd hardly ever seen when I was growing up, because he was a building worker, a construction worker, always working and up in the morning very early, home very late in the evenings. Suddenly he lost his job. He managed to get another job working in a shipyard. He was made redundant from that within 2 months of starting. And I couldn't fathom why it was that a guy who had worked hard all his life was now unable to find employment. And I couldn't fathom why, he had gone from being someone who the Tories would have called a taxpayer and a hard-working, upstanding member of the community, was now being labelled a skiver because he was having to claim benefits from the government. And it broke him. It really had a bad effect on his mental health. And I remember asking him, why have you stopped my pocket money? Why am I not getting pocket money anymore? And he explained he simply didn't have a very nominal amount in his pocket to give me. And then I went back to school and I began talking to a teacher who was a socialist. And I said to him, well, why is it that a guy who builds houses is unemployed, even though there are hundreds of thousands of slums in Britain that need pulling down and rebuilding? There are hundreds of thousands of construction workers who want to work. There are stockpiles of building materials in depots all over the country. Why can't we put those three component parts together and build houses? And it was things like that that made me realize that it's not a question of individuals not being able to work because they don't want to. It's a systemic question. It's a question that we live in a world which is run in the most absurd way by a tiny handful of multi-billionaires who, even in the last couple of days with Elon Musk's comments about Bitcoin, have really indicated that there's no longer any rationality in terms of how the world stock markets operate. It's all about simply chasing fictitious profits, what Karl Marx called fictitious capital. And I learned that lesson, therefore, at a very early age, that something was wrong with the system. And although I didn't have an enormous amount of understanding of Marxism at that stage, I was very keen to learn, because I realized that it wasn't enough to be angry, that if you wanted to make a difference, you had to get involved. And all around me at that time were big strikes taking place in the UK. And I could see that the Tory party was attacking the strikers, so it was a no-brainer that I couldn't be on their side. And I could see that within the Labour Party, there were those who were prepared to march with the working class, but there were also those who stayed quiet and didn't support working people. And I joined the Labour Party Young Socialists, and very quickly came under the influence of Marxists in the Young Socialists, who, if you like, gave me a vocabulary, whereas until then, mainly I'd had emotion. I was firing on anger, and anger is not enough. You need anger, you need passion in the belly to fight the system, but you need political direction as well, or otherwise you can get burned out, or at the very least, you can become directionless. You can just become even angrier and end up in dead end situations. Taking on the police, for instance, with a brick in your hand, which might make you feel good, but when you're in a cell later on and you've got a big fine to pay, you realize you haven't really changed the system. All you've done is, expostulated against the symptoms of the system. And I was more interested in getting to the roots of why are things like they are, how can we change them? So quite a political journey. I was 17 when I first got involved. I joined the Socialist Party's predecessor organisation when I was coming up to my 18th birthday, and that was a few years ago now. And I'm still active, still as passionate as ever, but hopefully now with a much broader understanding and a deeper understanding of what forces we're up against and how we can employ most effectively the necessary tactics to both expose the system, but also show to other people, young and not so young, like I was in 1973, that there is a point to fighting back, and that point, is about getting involved and organized, whether in your trade union or whether in a political party as well, which I would always say is a very important step. If you do all of that, then you quickly realize that fighting the system is not such an overwhelming task as you might think it is, because you are, alongside millions and millions of others across the world. And the key question is organizing around political ideas that can be effective. So quite a journey. I'm still on that journey now. I never stop learning. And, although I've been speaking for a little while, I always say to, fellow socialists that you need a strong larynx to be able to put your ideas across, but you also need a very acute pair of ears to listen to what ordinary people are saying, because some of the most inspirational things I've learned in my life have come from listening to workers on picket lines or in situations where they have been able to explain socialism in very simple language in a way that can reach out to other people. And you don't always have to regurgitate something you've read in a very thick, dusty book. What you have to do is be prepared to listen and interpret. So, that's my journey really, Tom and Stuart, and it's one that I'm still marching along.
Perfect. That sounds amazing. And you talk about, listening to, inspirational people on picket lines, working people. I also agree that, working people have been hugely important, in our societies. I think that most of the rights that we enjoy have come from, the agitation of the working class and, poor people. They weren't benevolently handed down by, governments or leaders or anything of that ilk. So trying to take those nuggets that you've learned over the years, what is socialism and what is it to you, Robin?
I think in a nutshell, socialism is about fighting for a world in which the people who produce the wealth own the wealth, control the wealth, and distribute the wealth in an equitable way. There's nothing radical about that concept when you stop and think about it. If you compare it to the world we live in today, where a handful of multi-billionaires control most of the wealth in the world, play monopoly with real money, with real people's lives every single day, then the extreme system is capitalism, a system that turns its back on coming up with meaningful solutions to climate change, a system which perpetuates directly or indirectly racism, sexism, attacks on people of different genders, and so on. And most importantly, the economic nature of capitalism means that it is a system that inevitably produces enormous waste, enormous duplication. It destroys people's lives, and perhaps if you were putting capitalism in the dock, one of its biggest crimes, one of the things you could most levy against capitalism is the crime of destroying people's aspirations, because especially in this period where we are going through a pandemic which has only hastened a recession that was very probable in 2020, then within the last 10 years, we've been through two economic catastrophes which have created a bigger division between the wealthy and the rest than ever seen in history. We have a situation where people like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk have earned shed loads of extra money in the last 12 months, whereas for most people, the uncertainty that surrounds their futures is a source of endless concern. For young people, especially, being brought up in the 21st century, which could be a world of superabundance given all the technologies we have and all the scientific progress we've made, instead, capitalism acts as a massive brake on economic progress, on social progress, but also in blighting people's lives. You just take the fact that while we're talking this evening, the second largest killer in the sub-Saharan African continent is measles. The pandemic may have put it now in third place, but measles, an entirely preventable disease, but a disease which is rampant in sub-Saharan Africa still, because under the dictatorship of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, many, many countries in that continent, and indeed across the entire world, have been put on austerity diets in the last 10, 20, 30 years, really. And many small countries in Africa have been told they have to rip up their indigenous medicine programs. They have to buy in pharmaceuticals from the US at obscenely inflated prices. And facing austerity, facing debt on a huge scale, many of those countries have had to cut the health programs that would have enabled young people to be vaccinated. So as we talk tonight, how many young people, and not just young people, are going to go to bed hungry, are not going to have access to clean water, are going to go to bed without a roof over their head, without security, without the knowledge of what tomorrow may bring? How many of those young people in turn could be potential artists, musicians, poets, engineers, scientists? But measles and diseases like measles will kill many of them before they reach the age of 15. And it's issues like that that show that the extremists in this society are those who defend that system using spurious arguments like, well, if you have socialism, then you take away individual initiative and you take away the expertise of people who, make millions out of marketing products that they themselves have invented. That's a lovely myth, because the truth is that there are armies of scientists and technicians behind every so-called successful millionaire. And they are the ones who put the gadgets together to give that millionaire his or her million. And therefore, socialism, I would say, is about saying that in the 21st century, when we have technologies that even 20 years ago would have seemed straight out of science fiction, when we can send satellites into the solar system, when we can talk about, in the future, a manned spaceship to Mars, why the hell can't we resolve these fundamental questions that affect people on the planet Earth? There is no technical reason why we couldn't have international cooperation to eradicate many of the diseases we see today. And of course, the current situation with the pandemic is an illustration of that, where you have countries competing against each other, you have pharmaceutical companies competing against each other. It's a real mess. And once again, it's ordinary people who paid a price. I want to see a world where a young person can say, when I grow up, I want to be a scientist or I want to be a musician, and they can have encouragement and a pathway towards realizing that dream, rather than the uncertainty of not being able, in many cases, to go to university because they can't afford to go to university, of finding that they have to live in dead-end jobs, earning extra money to pay for their fees if they go to university. So capitalism is the extreme system, and socialism, by comparison, is a very reasonable system. The people of Earth who make the wealth should control the wealth and own the wealth.
Absolutely.
That's a very good summary. We'll just loop that itself as its own episode, I think, just to remind people what socialism is. That's fantastic. I think like one of the most important pieces of what you've just mentioned then, I think, is competition, right? It's this whole us versus them mentality. So in the measles example, it's us being, the more wealthy Western countries for the most part, saying that like, oh no, we can't give you our money. Like we worked hard for this money. We can't possibly give you money and give you the support you need to break out of basically this indestructible position that we've like forced you into. Why should we fund the measles support that you need in your countries when we didn't have that? And I think it's the same with going clean energy, for example. We demand so much from these developing nations when the developed nations have had the chance to release all of the carbon into the atmosphere to fuel their growth in the past. But for some reason, we put this expectation on third world countries that like, oh no, you shouldn't have that chance. Why should you be focusing on economic development? You should be going as green as we should be going. And then in the US, for example, is an extreme example, but it's in every country around the world. Why should billionaires give up their money for the the everyday working people who are the ones actually putting in the effort to produce the goods? So when so much of capitalism is built into our mentality, how do we break apart that mentality to even show people that socialism isn't an extreme alternative? That socialism is actually the most appropriate, reasonable, and compassionate solution that we have for so many of the problems we face in the world.
When I first became politically active, the first piece of Marxist writing I read was the Manifesto of the Communist Party, a marvelous pamphlet which, in terms of its analytical method, is as fresh today as when it was written. And I remember reading the penultimate chapter where Marx and Engels list a number of demands that communists should fight for, and thinking to myself, well, many of those demands have been realized. They included very reasonable things like progressive taxation and public ownership of transportation and communication. And when I became active in the 1970s in the UK, all of those things existed. Relatively, there was a progressive taxation system. Big businesses paid 40% corporation tax or more. We had nationalized railways. We had nationalized buses. We had a nationalized energy sector, and water was publicly owned.
Mm-hmm.
When I reread the Communist Party manifesto a couple of years ago, it struck me that many of those demands that Marx and Engels were raising were now very relevant to the situation in the UK and many other advanced capitalist countries, because we have been through, ever since the advent of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in 1979 and 1980, respectively, a period of pushback by the capitalist class, where the post-war gains of the advanced Western countries, which saw a certain trickle-down effect for working class people in terms of better living standards than had existed prior to the Second World War, have all gone into reverse. And so privatization has been the mantra of the capitalist class for 40 years. We have had the eradication of progressive taxation. We've had situations where the super rich get away quite brazenly with tax avoidance on scale which would not have been conceivable in the 1970s. We've seen so many periods of job losses without proper jobs and proper retraining taking place that could enable people to continue to play fruitful roles in society. And to answer your question, Stuart, I think the point is that all of those experiences lead people individually and collectively as well into beginning to question the system. Marx famously said the capitalist system creates its own gravedigger in the form of the working class. Now, it would be marvellous if every worker drew the same political conclusions simultaneously about the failures of capitalism. That does not occur. But I think what makes people turn to socialism, what makes people look around for an alternative explanation of why things are as they are, is first and foremost their own experiences. And for instance, in the pandemic, I think millions of people, young people particularly, are questioning, what is happening? Why is this happening again? Why are we, skilled in terms of having university degrees quite often, yet still only able to find 0-hour contract jobs or precariat jobs? Why is it that the best we can aspire to is working for McDonald's, where they won't even allow us to join a trade union, and they close down a franchise if people try to join a trade union? Yeah. So I think the job of socialists like myself is to reach people who are drawing those conclusions and to explain why we need to become organized, why we need to fight back. Our job would be so much easier, however, if there were left parties like the Labour Party once was, and like the socialist parties in Europe once were, that at the very least put forward some opposition to capitalism. But one of the fundamental tragedies of the last 40 years has been the continual rightward retreat by these former socialist and Labour parties, which have embraced market economics, which have sought to justify privatization by saying that it's the necessary step that needs to be taken. And the working class has been left without a political voice. It's almost like from the time when I got involved to the period we're in now, there has been an attempt at mass political sensory deprivation, the wiping out of the hard drive of what went before. When I was at school, and about to leave school, we had all sorts of careers, people coming into school offering us a career in the army or in the engineering. But we had a visit from a trade union explaining to us that when we left school, it would be really important for us to join a trade union. Now, if that were to happen in the UK today, if a school were to invite a trade union in to speak to 18-year-olds, there would be uproar in the right-wing press. And the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, would probably join that uproar and say this is indoctrination. The reality is they stay silent about the indoctrination we face in school every single day. The fact that we learn the history of British imperialism, we don't learn about the struggle of the oppressed people who suffered at the hands of British imperialism. We don't learn about the Vietnam War and the heroic struggle of the Vietnamese against American imperialism. We learn instead about 15th and 16th century kings and queens in Britain, and we're fed the idea that history is made by great men and women, usually great men in their terms, because women were not supposed to be able to play great roles, with the very few exceptions. And, Marx makes the point in the Communist Manifesto that history is written by the victors, and the ruling ideas of any age tend to be the ideas of the ruling class. And what socialism is up against, first of all, is those ideas which are embedded in the educational system, in the judicial system, in every part of the establishment. But the added challenge we face is that we've seen the departure of these Labour and Socialist parties into acquiescence with capitalism, which means that for many working people, they don't need me to say to them when I meet them selling my newspaper, well, what's wrong with society? Because they can articulate very, very eloquently what's wrong with their lives, how their kids can't get jobs, how they can't afford decent housing. What they doubt is whether anything can be done about it. And I think the best antidote to those people who might think that socialism isn't popular is just to look at the incredible effect that the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party back in 2017 had in motivating and mobilising hundreds of thousands of young people and not so young people who joined up to support ideas which, frankly, weren't terribly extreme. They would have taken us back to the 1970s, renationalise the railways, get rid of student tuition fees, not in and of themselves revolutionary demands, but such a refreshing change from the narrative that people had heard for the previous 10, 15, 20 years. And the tragedy of that period was that, unfortunately, Corbyn was, like Julius Caesar, knifed by his closest associates, who were not Labour Party members at all, but stooges in the Labour Party, there to actually scupper his effective leadership. So, we have a job to do, and the Socialist Party is a Marxist party. We follow the methodology of Marx. For us, Marxism is not a dogma. You don't pick up Das Kapital, read it, and then regurgitate it to people on a street corner. We are people who analyze society using the methodology of Marxism, which starts by pointing out that we live in a class society, that the irreconcilable differences between the owners of capital and those who are forced to work for a living are not able to be resolved through a step-by-step reformist approach to slow organic change, but that rather we need to build strong organizations, both trade unions and political parties, that can challenge capitalism. Now, that means being on picket lines, that means supporting workers in very small struggles, as well as giving an explanation of the broader need for socialism. But in adopting that position, more and more, I'm meeting people who are saying, absolutely agree with you. That's what I think. I want to get involved. Yeah. And so it is a slower process than it would be if there were already strong social democratic parties there offering a different narrative. But given that there aren't, given that they've all left the scene, then a very important part of the Socialist Party's agenda is working with others on the left under an umbrella we call the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition to try and bring together the forces, firstly for an electoral challenge against right-wing Labour councillors who continue to make cuts, but secondly, using the Trade Unionist Socialist Coalition as a means of pressurising the trade unions that still give their money to the Labour Party to say, look, why are you giving money to a body that actually condemns you and doesn't support you, and when in government didn't take away any of the anti-trade union legislation? So this is a process, a dual process. We want to build our own forces to ensure that there is a strong Marxist core in British left politics, but we also want to draw in those people who maybe at this stage are not convinced Marxists, but they are prepared to tackle capitalism. And we say to those people, come under this broad umbrella, the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, and let us begin the fight to defend local services, to push back against austerity, to keep hospitals open, libraries open, and so on. So, we're not doctrinaire socialists who, stand aside from the day-to-day struggles that people are going through. On the contrary, we are rooted in those struggles. I kept a local library open at the bottom of my road 5-6 years ago when the Labour Party in the council tried to close it. And on the day that I went to the library, they sneakily announced the closure on the 23rd of December in expectation that no one would have the time to organise. On the 2nd of January, I was down at the library. I was speaking to a pensioners group who used the library as a resource for their meetings. And they had produced a handwritten petition with, a dozen or so shaky signatures on it. And I said, well, that's a start, but I'm here to help you. And I'm here to ensure that we can win. And, truthfully, at that stage, I couldn't guarantee we would win. But what we did through the Socialist Party was go to every single house in the area, knock on every single door, build a petition of over 5,000 signatures. Luckily, I was also at the time involved in my local school as a member of the governing body of the school. I was able to get the school on board because lots of the kids used the library after school because they didn't have computers at home. And we were able to shame the council into admitting that the library only cost £50,000 a year to run, including staff salaries. They only employed 2 staff at any one time. It's a small library.
Yep.
And so we were able to go to the council, and I spoke to the full council with a delegation of 50 people from my community behind me. And I had a real go at the Labour Party, and then the Tories started sniggering and laughing because they thought, they were off the hook. So I turned to the other side and pointed out I was coming after them as well. That as far as I was concerned, they were Tweedledee, Tweedledum, and Tweedledems, the 3 parties in Britain. That all with blood on their hands in terms of austerity policies. And we won. We kept that library open, and it's still open today. And we will have another fight this year because when the Labour Party wins the council in May, if the elections take place, which is probably what will happen, then they will try again to close the libraries. When I go through my community now, people come up to me and say, you're the guy who saved the library. And I always reply, no, we are the people who saved the library. It's not one person, it's the community that saved the library. But there's no doubt that because the Socialist Party was prepared all during a very cold January to go door to door knocking, speaking to people, organising meetings, we shamed those councillors. So it's a long answer, but it's an important point that we are an activist-based organisation. And I think for socialism to be really relevant, it has to be seen by ordinary people as connecting to the issues they are concerned about. Not just talking abstractly about socialism, but making socialism root and branch part of what people's own experiences are. Capitalism has helped us in that sense because it's showing every single day its ineptitude, its inability to even run things like the pandemic response in an organised way. So
absolutely,
we go for them, we go after them, we never leave them alone, we expose them because these people have, literally in some cases, blood on their hands, and none more so than this Tory administration in the UK, which has presided over 120,000 deaths now in a so-called advanced capitalist country. Incredible.
Absolutely incredible. That was amazing, Robin. So much that you, first of all, the example you give of you all working together to keep the library open. I think that's a fantastic illustration of what socialism could look like, with being proactive, not just something you think about in theory, reading Marx and pondering, pontificating about it. You spoke about so many different things there, like all things that we've touched on in this podcast, like the Labour Party, education, the history that we're taught in schools, everything. You partly alluded to it in your answer there, but one of the questions that I get often is, I think people struggle to understand or see a way to get to a socialist system. So how do we go about doing that? And what is the end goal? What do you think it looks like?
I think that, like any journey, it has to begin with the first step. And the first step for people who think they're socialists is to get involved in a socialist party, because very little can be achieved solely by individuals acting as individuals. Collectively, we can make a big difference. Now, there is skepticism among many young people about political parties, and the idea of parties conjures up the idea of hierarchies and people who basically sell you out at the end of the day. And I think we have to deconstruct that and say that actually the word party merely means an association of people. And what's primary is not the organizational structure, but the political ideas around which you're fighting. And you have to have a democratic structure as well. I mean, the Socialist Party has an annual conference. We elect a leadership to serve for 12 months. Every member of the Socialist Party who obtains a public position in a trade union or, in the future as councillors or MPs will only be permitted to take the equivalent wage of those people they represent, and any genuine expenses they incur will be paid back into the movement once they have been recompensed for, train fares that they may otherwise not be able to afford out their own pockets. But we've not only preached that abstractly. In the 1980s, we had 3 MPs in the British Parliament, and all 3 of them were elected on the basis of a workers' MP on a worker's wage. One of those, in 1990, went to prison for refusing to pay the poor tax, which was a particularly iniquitous piece of local government legislation introduced by Margaret Thatcher's Tories, which said that each person living in a household had to pay an individual community tax. The effect was that in some households with 4 adults, the amount payable rose from £500 to £2,000. And it led to a massive uproar in Britain. And again, the Socialist Party was at the very core of organising mass protest. We organised, massive bill burning events in towns and cities across the UK. But we then began to organise street by street, community by community, around the idea of mass non-payment, recognising that there were many who wouldn't pay out of principle, but there were many, many others who would not be able to afford these bills. And Margaret Thatcher had boasted that this would be her flagship policy she would be remembered for. And we retorted, yes, you will be remembered for it, but we will turn it into your Titanic. We will sink your poor tax. Now, what happened was 18 million people refused in England, Scotland, and Wales to pay the poor tax. Even the Tories weren't stupid enough to impose it in Northern Ireland. But we presided over the most incredible 2 years of activism, with the Socialist Party forming the All Britain Federation of Anti-Poor Tax Unions. I attended a meeting 10 minutes from my house. Me and one other comrade, it was held in a local school hall. We expected about 20 people, and it was an information meeting where we were explaining how you could legally avoid paying the poor tax and what would happen if you were prosecuted. When we turned up, the first person we saw was a school caretaker who said, "I'm going to have to close the meeting." And we said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, there are 200 people inside, and the classroom only takes 50 people. And we couldn't get inside, so we had to shout out to people, "Hang on, we're the speakers, let us in." We got into that meeting, we quickly realised that we could not have a meeting in a classroom. Luckily, it was a dry night. So my colleague went outside into the playground, and he addressed 100 people or 150 people. I stayed in the classroom and addressed the other 50 people. But that night, and in many other scenarios in that period, I saw ordinary people beginning to do extraordinary things. I saw ordinary people coming behind the idea that this is unjust, we're prepared to fight it. And I think the trigger for building a socialist movement will be similar to that. Most people reach a breaking point where they no longer feel that they can stay quiet. Now, interestingly, Stuart, I spoke to someone who wants to join the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, I should say, yesterday. And she's from Perth originally, in Western Australia. And she was a trade union activist there, very, very active socialist from what she told me. But she's landed in the UK. She's now living here permanently in a tiny little fishing village called Brixham. And she wants to get active again, and she wants to engage with the fishermen about the way their industry is being destroyed at the moment. And she made the point to me that, when she came to the UK, she wasn't intending to get involved again. She felt she'd done her bit in Australia. But looking at the injustice around her, she felt that old motivation creeping up again and realized that, she needed to be involved. And she has joined us in the last 24 hours. And I think to go from where we are today to where we need to go, we need to recognize that, firstly, the situation that ordinary people face is only going to get worse. There is no possibility of a restoration of the post-war boom years that existed in countries like the UK, America, and Australia between 1950 and 1975. We are facing now a period of chronic capitalist instability. Capitalism is no longer even fit for purpose in terms of carrying out its historical mission, which was to take the surplus value that it extracted from workers and use a portion of that, surplus value in investing in new plant, new material, new technique, in order to bring down the productivity of labor, or rather to increase the productivity of human labor. Instead, capitalism more and more is reliant on fictitious investments through the world stock exchanges, through Bitcoin, through the hedge funds, the derivatives market, the credit default swaps market. And you have the absurdity of the capitalist on the stock exchange betting on what the wheat harvest is going to be like in 2025 in Canada. And, they'll make a bet. And then if they think that the wheat harvest isn't going to be as high, they'll take their money out of that and they'll put it somewhere else. It's an enormous skyscraper built on chicken's legs, and it will collapse. It collapsed in 2007. It will collapse again. The current, stratospheric growth in the stock market in Wall Street in the UK, it's all built on sand. It's going to be the case that there will be another huge collapse. And it's experiences like that which will draw more and more people into the realization that this system isn't working and we need a change. Now, the building of new mass workers' parties is a very important component part of this project. We can't, as a socialist party, as a revolutionary Marxist party, we can't claim to be that new mass workers' party. We can, however, be a very important catalyst in helping to bring that about. And some people might say, well, wouldn't you be losers if you did that? Because more people would join that party than would join your party. But we don't see it in sectarian terms like that. We see it as being objectively necessary that workers have political representation through new left parties in which we will play a quite decisive role. And through the genuine dialogue that we will have in parties like that, hoping, that they will have genuinely federal constitutions where different views are not only tolerated but encouraged, we will win more and more people over to the idea that actually the best form of socialism, the form of socialism that can actually result in, the victory of socialism, is Marxism. Because one of the things that the last 150 years have shown is that there is no reformist road to socialism. In some periods, workers, if they have strong organizations, can win gains. They can win a national health service. They can win big pay rises. They can win better improvements in housing and education. But then in other periods, the capitalists will come back and take those away again. There is no slow, organic road to socialism. It's as utopian as believing that you can creep into a tiger's cage while it's sleeping, pull out a pair of tweezers, start taking its teeth out one by one without it waking up and biting your head off. And obviously anybody who's ever tried that isn't here to tell the story because they're in a grave somewhere. But, the whole lesson of history is that no social system gives up without a titanic struggle to retain its privileges. And that's why socialists have to be organized. We have potentially billions of people who will fight against capitalism in the future, but they have to be armed with a program. They have to be confident. They have to have organizations that are prepared to fight for them, in which they trust. And the revolution is not something that someone like myself, or even Karl Marx, if he were here today, could conjure up just by wishing it. A revolution is not the caricature of a few people with bombs under their arms blowing up the Houses of Parliament. A revolution is an elemental social movement of millions of people who've reached that point of declaring that enough is enough. But then when you have the potential for a revolution, as Russia showed in 1917, without a revolutionary party that is prepared to go all the way, that is already rooted in the working class and can take those decisive measures in terms of expropriating the banks, the key companies, the energy companies, and so on, then the capitalists will crawl back. I've just been reading material about the Egyptian revolution of 10 years ago, the Tahrir Square uprising, a magnificent uprising. Yeah. The heroism of the young people in Tahrir Square was not to be questioned. They were prepared to go to the end. And there were 2 or 3 weeks in which the state apparatus hung in the balance. The policemen had taken off their uniforms and pretended to become civilians. The soldiers had come over to the side of the people because most of the conscript army had friends and relatives in Tahrir Square. Had there been a revolutionary party present in Cairo or the rest of Egypt as well, it would have been entirely possible to largely peaceably take political and economic power. The reaction would have come from the capitalists firing guns, not the working class. But because there was no political party, that revolution was in a vacuum for about 3 weeks. And as Marx said, you know, the pendulum of history doesn't stay still. If you do not take advantage of a favorable situation, the capitalist class, even if they seem down and out, will regroup, will recover, and will come back, and they will crush you. We saw it in Chile in 1973, when a left-wing government led by a guy called Salvador Allende, the socialist government, was prevaricating, was not prepared to, you know, give the full support necessary to the working class in defending the revolution. And the Pinochet regime came in and brutally, you know, destroyed that revolution. Over 50,000 Chileans, mainly young people, died. I was in the Socialist Party then, in our predecessor organization. I was at a meeting on the night of the coup. And when the news came through, we had extremely heavy hearts, of course, because we had been desperately writing to young socialists in Chile, warning them that the Chilean working class needed to be armed against Pinochet, that a coup was coming, propagated by America, of course, as was the case across Latin America through a whole historical period. But we knew that Allende regime was not lacking heroism, that Allende himself was a heroic individual, but heroism is not enough unless you have a program that is prepared to go the whole way to change society. You can't stop halfway. It's like standing in the middle of the road. You get run over. You either decisively decide you are a revolutionary and you're going to fight to change society, and you set about building the forces and ultimately the millions that will carry that through, or you end up thinking that your ambition can go no further than simply winning a pay rise for a group of workers or keeping a local library open. Those are important battles, but they are not the most important battle. The capitalist state, Marx talked about it in many, many of his writings. The capitalist state, the army, the police, the judiciary, those are ultimately the defenders of the capitalist system. If you took Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and all the others, all the big capitalists in the world, you could put them in a football stadium and still have half the stadium empty. There aren't that many of them. A few thousand people control the world. But for them to control the world effectively, they pay for a state apparatus. They pay for the army, the police. And of course, not every soldier is a fascist. We don't buy that argument. You can even win over policemen. If the police think the revolution is serious, some of them will come over to the revolution. If they think the revolution is dithering and maybe the revolutionaries aren't serious, why should the police come over? They'll take their orders from their officers in that case.
Yeah.
So, we're going to see, with or without socialist revolutionaries, we're going to see revolutionary explosions across the world in the next decade, 2 decades, like we saw in Egypt, like we have seen in other countries. The key question, though, is will there be parties built with Marxist programs that are able to take, that opportunity and carry it through? Or will those revolutions be stillborn? Will those revolutions be defeated bloodily? Now, that can seem a very distant period from where we are today. And where we are today is in building the political understanding necessary to raise these ideas. But whilst we are in the trenches today fighting against job cuts and for pay increases and everything else, we always have to link those issues to the bigger picture that capitalism in the 21st century cannot be allowed to stay in charge. We face an environmental crisis of unparalleled threat now. Everyone's cheering because Joe Biden says he's going back into the Paris Accords. But the Paris Accords are useless. They have no teeth. They put no demands on individual governments, which find a million ways to wriggle out of commitments. And a treaty on a piece of paper is not the same as an international decision to do something effectively. And now I read that the scientists say that it's not a question any longer of adhering to cutting the carbon just by a certain amount. We need bigger cuts. We have the tundra in Siberia is beginning to melt. We have the development of methane leaks, and methane is 10 times more dangerous than carbon dioxide. This is what capitalism does. Capitalism, pontificates. All the governments come together and they say, "Oh, this is terrible. We must do something. We must do something." And then they look around and they say, "Well, who's going to go first?" And there's a deadly
like Davos
silence.
as well, isn't it?
It's just like Davos.
Yeah.
And it was interesting a few years ago. One of them at Davos, he actually made a speech in which he said, "Unless we do something, it's going to be like the French revolutions. The pitchforks will be coming for us." And everyone agreed, and I'm sure the Zuckerbergs and all the others, they were all saying, yeah, he's right. He's got a good point there. Something has to be done. But the problem is that the system they preside over is the problem. And they're not going to dismantle their own system. It's like the capitalist, the hypocrite who goes to church on a Sunday and gives to charity and cries genuine tears when he or she hears the poverty in Africa. But then on Monday morning, they go back into the office and they play, Monopoly with real people's lives, and they are responsible for that poverty. But they've salved their conscience on Sunday morning by giving a few quid to a charity, which they've then got back on tax relief probably anyway. Yeah. So it's like, it's not a question of whether these people are nice individuals. Most of them, are hard-nosed capitalists who don't have scruple. But even if they did have scruple, it's about the fact that the system of capitalism corrupts, and it corrupts people in an organic way. And therefore, the case is unarguable. We need to change it.
Okay. A lot to think about there, which is absolutely brilliant. Let's go to Marx then, and Capital. I understand that it's going to be really difficult to synthesize his work in such a short space of time, but we want to try and make it bite-sized and accessible to our audience. So maybe thinking about how he took the labour theory of value from Smith and Ricardo and things like that, and maybe the money trick and things like that. Can you, advise us what the main points are that we should take from such a work?
I think that what Marx explained more clearly than had been understood before by any of the classical economists was that value is produced by the working class. Surplus value is that extracted value that the capitalist takes from the labor power of the working class. So to take a very simple example, if a worker works for 10 hours per day, at the end of the week, having worked for 50 hours, the worker gets, and these are purely arbitrary figures, the worker gets £100 in wages. So the worker thinks, well, I've worked for 50 hours, I've got £100 in wages. But the trick is that in those 50 hours, by adding his or her labor power to the raw materials and the machinery, the worker has produced not £100, but maybe £1,000. Again, the figure is arbitrary. And the worker works, therefore, only some of the week to replace his or her wages. The rest of the week is surplus labor, surplus value. And surplus value is then taken by the capitalist and divided between rent, interest, and profit. And the net profit that the capitalist ends up with is that capitalist to do what he or she wants to do with. Now, historically, the only justification for capitalism as an advance on the feudalist system that preceded it was that it was able to develop the means of production. It was able to create a world market. It was able, through reinvesting surplus value back into industry, to increase the productivity of human labor, to produce more consumer goods. But as I've already said, that system has largely come undone now. We have a situation where historically productivity levels in the US are lower than they've been for 50 years. There has hardly been any increase in productivity since 2000 in the United States. Now, we live in a society today where, of course, many of the industries that Marx wrote about do not exist in the same form as they did in his day. But one of the key things that Marx also talked about was the growing monopolization of capital, something that was further developed by Lenin in his writings on imperialism, that the laissez-faire model, the small individual producers that Marx mainly observed in Britain, were gobbled up by larger companies. Monopolies grew out of those companies. And because of the fact that the capitalist market, at any stage in its history, is made up of competing national interests, but also within each nation state, competing sectional interests and competing private interests, there is no capability to produce a plan of production. There is no desire to produce a plan of production. So, if the three of us were to decide that we were going to cash in on the latest skateboard craze, for instance, we might all live in the same city but have no knowledge of each other. So we would all start producing skateboards. We would reach a point where we were in competition with each other. We began to realize there were other people in the market, so we would increase the intensification of labor of our workforce to try and make them produce more skateboards in a same amount of time so we could undercut the price. Ultimately, one of the three of us would go out of business, and probably the other one of us would be bought up by the most successful of the three, creating a huge waste and dislocation to a sphere of the economy, which in the case of skateboards is not the biggest sphere of economy. But this happens in food. This happens in textiles. This happens in every sphere of economy. And so you have in capitalism, Marx explained these periodic crises of overproduction, which is an absurd concept because in all previous societies, human beings struggled to produce enough food, to produce enough shelter, and so on. Capitalism, for the first time in human history, has the potential to create these surpluses, but instead of those surpluses being regulated or planned, in which case they wouldn't be vast surpluses which end up getting buried back into the earth in the case of surplus food, you end up with these crises of overproduction where the capitalists can't sell the commodities they produce, where they therefore lay off workers, they are forced out of business. The working class essentially never is able to buy back the full product of its labor power. The worker works for 40 hours or 50 hours, but doesn't get the full value, as I've explained, because that's appropriated by the capitalist as surplus value. And therefore, that coupled with the fact that there is no check on market production methods means that inevitably, inbuilt into the capitalist system, is this so-called boom-slump cycle. And we're in a phase of capitalism now where historically low growth rates, particularly in the US, but even in China compared to the period of 1980 to 2000, means that we are seeing the capitalists try and find other means of making value. And they're turning to fictitious values, the stock market, the Bitcoin, the other things I've already mentioned. Frederick Engels said in 1890 that the role of stock markets at best is to provide a resource for the capitalist to borrow in order to reinvest, retool, and so on. But he also pointed out that there were a whole army of people whom he called coupon clippers, who effectively don't produce anything. They're not capitalists in an industrial sense, but they're hangers-on. They profit from the surplus value created by the working class. Now, Engels and Marx would be astonished if they came back today and saw just how many of these coupon clippers there are and how they have proliferated and what scams they have developed. You know, the giant Ponzi schemes, the fraudulent schemes that, you know, frequently hit the financial pages. Usually, you know, in the Financial Times, they sneer at the fact these Ponzi schemes exist in neo-colonial countries, but actually they came from the advanced capitalist countries. The model for all the Ponzi schemes came from the UK, came from America. And I think, therefore, Marx's Capital is first of all an analysis of the historic growth of capitalism. Marx was not sentimental about capitalism. He said famously that capitalism came into the world dripping with blood from every pore. It came into the world, at least in part, aided by the slave trade and the vast profits that were made by merchants in the UK in terms of the slave trade. But Marx also made the point that in its inception, despite those horrors, capitalism played a revolutionary role in an economic sense in breaking up the narrowness of the feudal guilds, of opening up the beginning, at least, of a world market. And he makes the point in Capital that, you know, wherever capital goes, it creates its own image. All the national identities are trampled upon, all the national traditions are trampled upon, and the capitalists, particularly the richer capitalist countries, then, you know, move into the imperialistic phase, the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, and so on. And, you know, many of those imperialistic developments were accompanied by direct colonialism. But of course, imperialism doesn't have to be associated with direct colonialism. You know, if you look at American imperialism, it doesn't nominally station its soldiers in other countries, you know, who at bayonet point, force workers to work harder to make more money.
Yeah.
But imperialism is the domination of finance capital. Above all, the growth of monopolization, the domination of finance capital and the banking sector, the export of capital, tying developing countries into prisoner rules, really, forced to borrow from the Western banks, but at a price of destroying their own materials. So when the British left Ghana, for instance, in West Africa, the last thing the British Empire did, the last great sort of act of help to the Ghanaian people, was to smash up every single factory that existed in Ghana. And Ghana had, even before British enslavement, a very developed economy compared to a lot of other African countries.
Mm-hmm.
The same was true in India, that, the British smashed up all the textile industry, the indigenous Indian textile industry, in order then to force them to buy back from Britain. And so imperialism is a ruthless machine. But the starting point is that understanding of the labor theory of value. And Marx says everything has, a dual value, a use value and an exchange value. The use value is determined by whether someone wants what you've produced. If they don't want it, you won't sell it.
Yeah.
But it isn't the use value that creates the surplus for the capitalist class. It's the exchange value. It's the act of a product becoming a commodity. A product is something you produce. A capitalist can produce it, or you can produce it as an individual. But once you commodify those products by selling them on the market, if they have had labor added to them in the act of production, then necessarily you are making a surplus, because you're capitalizing upon the difference between what you had to pay your workforce and what you actually pocket by selling that commodity at its exchange value. So the system is not an effective system. It's made even more complicated by the existence of rival nation states and rival power blocks. We see a very good example over the last few years with, Trump introducing tariffs against China, but also turning his back on the EU, turning his back on all those post-war organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and even the World Health Organization. And we're entering into a new era of, greater and greater protectionism between capitalist countries. We've seen a more recent example in the spat between the EU and the UK over the allocation of the vaccines. And all these things show that this is not a tranquil growth period for world capitalism. This is a period which increasingly resembles some of the features that were seen in the 1930s, which obviously in that period led inexorably to war between, the different imperialist nations.
Yeah.
And so, I think, like I said right at the beginning, it's really important to study Marx's Capital. It's not the most digestible piece of work for people who don't, feel confident about economics. The entire first chapter is 60 or 70 pages describing the dual side of a commodity of having both a use value and an exchange value. But Marx's method in Capital is to go over and over the point, so he drives it home. And once you realize that, you can actually glean from the first 10 pages of the first chapter what he's getting at. But the other material in Capital, particularly the chapter on the working day, it could have been written yesterday. The exploitation of workers, the terrible conditions, the adulteration of food. Again, something we've seen. One of the very first acts of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 was to lean on the food industry and pass legislation giving them permission to take some of the nutrients out of bread, because the bakeries were complaining that the price of bread was being driven too high because of all the vitamins and nutrients they had to put in it. So Thatcher gave them a pass and said, okay, you can effectively adulterate the bread. Marx talks about that. He talks about the extension of the working day under capitalism, how some workers were working 18 hours a day to survive. Now, when I first read Capital, I probably thought, it's good we're not in that place anymore. But then you look around and, I know people personally who have 4 jobs. They have a cleaning job in the morning. They work in a supermarket while their kids are at school in the later morning. They then do another cleaning job in the evening. And then on top of that, they do a babysitting job. And all of that doesn't give them a decent living wage.
Unbelievable.
So it is unbelievable. But it's things like that bring home to you that, Marx's method has not been superseded by any theory which more accurately describes the reality of the class struggle that exists in the 21st century. As Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, once said, if there was a theory that had superseded Marx, then it would be the duty of every Marxist to embrace that theory, because we all want a quicker road to socialism. We don't have a hang-up about Marx, being a genius. I think he was a genius in terms of his analytical understanding, as was Engels. But the reality is there has been no more modern theory. Periodically, politicians like Tony Blair come up with what they think is a unique new theory. Blair came up with a third way. And then you have proponents of things like modern monetary theory today who say, well, why can't governments just continue allowing deficits to get bigger and bigger? They can always pay those deficits. But those questions avoid the central question, which is that they're trying to find fixes within a capitalist society. And ultimately, there will not be fixes that both benefit capitalism and the working class. They are mutually exclusive. The working class, Marx begins the Communist Manifesto with the famous phrase that the existence of all previous societies is the existence of class struggle. And, the class struggle takes different forms in different ages, but the class struggle between those who have the means of production and those who have to work to earn a crust has been a constant throughout all recorded history. He also says, that, or Engels says that, the very first societies, the tribal societies, which Engels, inelegantly calls barbarian societies. I don't think that's terminology we would use today. But, there's a point to be made there. I mean, not every word that Engels or Marx wrote, was historically completely accurate. Engels, in one of his writings, speculates on why it is that parrots can speak, and he comes up with some very strange ideas, which have been disproved now. And we know that parrots are mimics, and that if you take them out of their social wild situation, they appear to mimic the voice they hear. Now, is Engels to be made redundant because he got that wrong? Well, no. I mean, the entire development of science, the entire development of human knowledge has meant that, people who've come later, who've had greater scientific insights and techniques for looking at science, have been able to modify what went before. Darwin was a revolutionary, but Darwin was not the last word. Darwin laid the basis for all the modern, developments. But in terms of the essence of Marxism, it's not a dogma, it's a method, and it's still the best method for understanding the world we live in. But it has to be added to, and it has to be updated in those areas where new change circumstances, the existence of, computer technologies and so on, mean that we have to look at how the law of labor value applies in this field as well. But those are often used as examples by people who want to harm Marxism, to say, well, Marx got it wrong, or Marx, there are no absolutes. As Marxists, we see the only absolute is constant change, if you like, constant change through contradiction. And what we're always trying to do in evolving our political map of where we want to get to is examine perspectives, examine what's happening, what's the likely next development. But we can never be absolutely 100% certain about that. History will throw up sudden explosions. Like sometimes you will get a volcano that's been dormant for centuries and it can start reactivating. What you have to do, though, is respond to those new situations based upon the methodology that we use. We're scientific socialists. We're not simply reactors. There are plenty of people who react to the accomplished fact. But as Leon Trotsky once put it, the advantage of Marxism over other theories is the advantage of foresight over astonishment. And that foresight doesn't give you an infallible crystal ball, but what it does do is enable you to map out the broad terrain on which you're fighting. And for us, the key point is capitalism is not in a state of historical development at the moment. It is riven with contradictions. Western capitalism is very weak. America no longer enjoys the unilateral sort of primacy in terms of the imperialist countries. Even China, there's been an astonishing turnaround in China in the last 40 years. But even China, by adopting, a more pro-capitalist road, form of state capitalism, will introduce into its body politic all the contradictions of capitalism. It will introduce the political virus into its system. And we're beginning to see that. There are millions of peasants who've been brought into the cities and have become workers. And yet, what has that created? It's created a massive strike movement in China. We unfortunately don't learn about that much of the time because it's repressed. Yeah. It's never mentioned in the Western press. But we have, people in China who tell us what is happening. They have to smuggle out information. But what we're seeing in China is what we saw perhaps in the UK in the 19th century, the opening up of these huge new workforces where a trade union consciousness can grow very quickly, albeit underground, because it's not legal to be a proper trade unionist in China. You have to belong to a state trade union. But therefore, there is no corner of the world. Let's look at Australia. Australia went through a 30-year boom, largely as a result of the export of minerals to East Asia and to China particularly. But now Australia is feeling the chill winds of recession as China begins to adopt a kind of spiteful rebuke to Australia for criticizing its policies. And, therefore, Australian workers who've generally speaking avoided recession in the last period, they will too become acquainted with the reality of capitalism. I just want to add one point before I finish, which is that it's not just recession itself that creates revolution. It's the oscillation between, big recessions, small recoveries, and the uncertainty that creates in people's lives. That's the yeast, if you like, that begins to create the revolutionary consciousness that we can't carry on like this. Things have to change.
Absolutely. Lots and lots of stuff to think about there, Robin. Thank you for breaking the what Marx has done down into a more manageable chunk. So I hope the audience can latch onto that. Can we speak a little bit about you alluded to it earlier, but the left and the Labour Party, because you spoke about Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, we've had my school friend Hannah O'Rourke come on and talk about her work with Labour together in a previous episode. So my own personal view on the Labour Party is that they had my support when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. I thought that, as you said, what he was suggesting was not too radical. I thought it was the right direction that we needed to be going in. And so I was certainly a supporter of what he wanted to do. What are your thoughts on the Labour Party as it currently is under Starmer? And, do you think that maybe the future of politics on the left lies outside of the Labour Party, maybe?
I think that Starmer is taking the Labour Party back to a Blairite position. And by that, I mean the neoliberal embrace of the market that characterized the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown years. I think that the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party illustrates how far Starmer is prepared to go to appear to be a loyal lieutenant of capitalism. I think the fact that the Labour Party think tanks have come up with this wonderful idea that the way Labour is going to win working class votes is by surrounding itself with the Union Jack flag
Patriotism.
and patriotism and attacks on immigration all indicate that the Labour Party is in free fall and is reversing back to the Blairite agenda. And I think, therefore, there is no mileage any longer in expecting the Labour Party to be won back again by the left. Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party completely by accident. He was only put on the ballot paper by right-wing MPs who added his name in order to humiliate what they thought was an insignificant and dwindling Labour left. What they didn't factor in was a social upheaval on the ground across the country, the discontent with the Tories, the anger at the Liberal Democrats and the betrayals they had made in the Cameron government. And nobody was more surprised probably than Jeremy Corbyn when he became the leader. He was, really not expecting to be the leader. We spoke with Jeremy Corbyn immediately after he became leader, and one of the first things we asked him was to allow the Socialist Party to federate, to affiliate to the Labour Party. We pointed out that we had been in the Labour Party in the 1960s, 70s and 80s before being expelled. And we said to him, look, we have your back. We will be the forces in the Labour Party who will be most loyal and determined to ensure that your policies are carried through. But we also gave him a warning. We said that there are people in the Labour Party, particularly in the parliamentary party and in the council chambers, who will stop at nothing to destroy your project. And he agreed with us. He said, well, I would like to readmit Socialist Party back into the Labour Party. But if I do that, there will be resignations, there will be threats, the Labour right will move against me. And from that moment, we knew, therefore, that there was going to be the mother and father of all battles in the Labour Party. Now, when Momentum was set up, we were very pleased initially. We saw it as a left-wing pressure group. I was invited to speak at the first Momentum meeting in Bristol from the floor, not from the platform. And Socialist Party members went along, and I pointed out that personally, I had been in the Labour Party for 20 years as a Marxist, that I had sat on the regional executive committee of the Labour Party for 4 years, that I was chair of the Young Socialists for 3 years. And I said, look, we support everything that Jeremy Corbyn stands for, but we have to be realistic and recognise that there are those in the Labour Party who will sabotage him. And, when he was then challenged by a right-wing candidate, Owen Smith, he won a handsome victory, became leader for the second time. And again, we tried to warn him through a whole series of articles in our paper and through communications with our former Labour MP, Dave Nellis, who had been a colleague of Jeremy Corbyn's in the Labour Party for a number of years, a member of the campaign group of left-wing Labour MPs. We tried to warn him that he didn't have unlimited time. We actually said that he should take measures against those people in the shadow cabinet who were sabotaging him, even, being prepared, if necessary, to expel them from the Labour Party because they were not Labour. And when John McDonnell then, buckled and said that he thought Labour councillors were doing a great job and they had no alternative but to carry through austerity policies. Again, the writing was on the wall, because what that was John McDonnell saying, look, we're not prepared to take on right-wing Labour councillors, and we're going to go down the road of trying to pacify the right and hope that we can convince them that we are good guys. But unfortunately, and I may have used this analogy before, but you know, it's akin to being a child in a school playground and being confronted by a bully who demands your pocket money, and you give that bully your pocket money, and you hope throughout the next evening that the bully isn't going to come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
But invariably, the bully does come back, and the bully comes back the next day and asks for more, and asks for more. And you either have to get assistance from a third party to deal with that bully, or you have to deal with that bully yourself. And it was exactly the same. You know, it was like having a situation where you're in a sports team and you find out that when the game starts, half the team are playing for the other side. You know, you can't win in that situation. And no amount of compromises by Jeremy Corbyn, no amount of political integrity and honesty and appealing to their better natures was ever going to stop them from going after him. And of course, they made allusions to the fact he had been a communist spy. That didn't really cut much ice. Then they tried to say he was soft on terrorism, that he'd been, you know, a defender of extreme Palestinian groups. That didn't cut much ice. But then they hit upon the allegation of anti-Semitism completely falsely. You know, they ignored the fact that in Jeremy Corbyn's own constituency, the rabbi and the local synagogue came out and said what a fantastic role he'd always played in defending Jewish interests against, you know, racism and so on. But of course, you know, you expect the Daily Mail and the right-wing media to attack you if you're Jeremy Corbyn. But when the majority of your parliamentary party are attacking you, and councillors all across the country are attacking you, and when Keir Starmer on the Labour front bench is a Trojan horse for the right wing and is meeting with them secretly before every meeting to unnerve Jeremy Corbyn, then you have a problem. And the problem was exacerbated by the fact that the Labour Party tried to face two ways on the question of Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn is an instinctive opponent of the European Union as it's currently constituted. And we argued to him he should come out and nail his colours to the mast and actually make the case for a people's Brexit, explaining that, you know, he would be prepared to do a renegotiation with the EU, but only if that were taking away all the anti-trade union legislation and so on that the EU had imposed upon Britain and every other country. But at the same time, to the ordinary worker, Labour seemed confused, Labour seemed split. So now we think it's time to recognise that the Labour Party under Starmer is no longer the organisation in which to fight. Corbyn has formed a new organisation or a project, really, you know, to Peace and Justice Project. You know, I don't want to be unkind, but in a certain sense, it's like a retirement statement. You know, it's going to involve lots of, you know, people writing lots of very learned papers about injustice and oppression, particularly in other countries, all of which is worthy, but none of which actually deals with the fundamental questions here and now about what socialists in Britain should do. And I think that, you know, the best thing Jeremy Corbyn could do, and we've said this to him, is he's suspended from the Labour Party, as you know. The best thing he could do is announce that he's going to stand in the London mayoral election as an independent socialist, and he could get elected by a landslide in London, standing as a principled socialist, as Ken Livingstone did many years ago. Livingstone then quickly rejoined the Labour Party, but Jeremy Corbyn would actually do a great service to young people and workers who supported him in the years when he was leader if he stood for the London mayoral seat. Whereas I'm afraid the Peace and Justice project is very amorphous. It won't appeal to the ordinary worker on the shop floor. It won't mean anything. They might agree with the laudable aims. They might agree with, the aspiration of a better world. But we have to go beyond just wanting a better world. We have to know how to fight for that better world. So I think now we've noticed in the Socialist Party, we've had a whole series of people join us from the Labour Party, some of whom or most of whom are brilliant, actually. They're really, really engaged, energetic young people. But what is the great tragedy of the Corbyn years is the wasted opportunity. There was an opportunity to strike out on a new path. But unfortunately, as I said right at the beginning, even Jeremy Corbyn, for whom I have a great personal, admiration, I've met him, I've spoken with him and so on. Jeremy Corbyn, it isn't enough to be a nice guy in this era. The people who are successful are people who have, a clear agenda, whether that's on the right, people like Donald Trump, who really went for what he wanted and did what he wanted. The left has to have leaders like that, obviously not in the sense of just fighting the same arguments, but the left has to be able to spell out socialist ideas in simple language that engages people. When he spoke around the country at the mass rallies, he did that. He spoke in Bristol, my city, and there were 15,000 people in a midweek lunchtime came to hear him speak. The trouble was that he was being sabotaged all the time. It's okay speaking at the rallies, but if you're being killed by your own side, you're not going to win. And so,
and the media,
but the media we take as read. The right wing media will always give you a rough time. You've got to find ways. And for me, I spent 20 years in the Labour Party as a Marxist organizer, proudly, making it plain who I was. And I never won many resolutions and many votes. But those were days in which the Labour Party was still a broad church and would be tolerant of different views. Eventually, I was expelled from the Labour Party for organising a campaign against the aforementioned poll tax. The local Labour Party leader said I was inciting people to break the law, which was just bullshit. What I was saying to people was, if you can't afford to pay the poll tax, we'll defend you, we'll protect you, we'll organise local community groups to stand together to stop bailiffs coming into your house and taking your possessions or sending you to jail. But I think this pattern of what we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, unfortunately, is a repetition of the pattern we've seen in other countries, and in particular in Greece with the Syriza government. Because, the Syriza government, Alexis Tsipras and Varoufakis and others, they were sincere guys. And they actually went to the Greek people and they got a mandate from the Greek people to stand up to the European Commission and to refuse to carry through austerity policies. But then within 24 hours of going to the European Commission, as Varoufakis has admitted himself, they were browbeaten, they were blackmailed, they were told they had to carry through cuts. And Syriza squandered an enormously favourable opportunity. And this is where reformism ends up in this era. Because, in the period of capitalist boom in the 50s and 60s, there was a place for negotiating concessions. A lot of the capitalists would give you a big pay rise because they didn't want to go through the hassle of a strike. They could afford a pay rise. They were making super profits. In this era of neoliberalism and globalization, the capitalists are playing hardball, and they will not allow or tolerate a left-wing social democratic party to threaten their interests if they think they can frighten that social democratic party into retreating. And that's why ultimately, despite his personal qualities, Jeremy Corbyn will go down in history as a man who gave us a glimpse of the forces that could be won to socialism, but also through its own passivity and is being outmaneuvered by the right, squandered that opportunity. And the sad thing is, many of those young people who joined the Labour Party were never given any guidance as to what they should then do as the next step.
Yeah.
You know, if I'd have been in the Labour Party, I'd have got all those young people together in my local area, and I'd have said, look, we're going to go to the next Labour Party meeting, we're going to pass a motion of no confidence in the right-wing MP, and we're going to demand and fight for a campaign to deselect that right-wing MP and replace her or him with someone who is a Corbynite. That would have been a bloody battle. We might not have won it, but it would have engaged young people and made them see in turn that it wasn't enough just to pay £5 to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. You had to go into the party to operate. That's what I hoped the Momentum organisation would be, an organisation that drew the left together and produced a battle plan, if you like, for winning the fight against the right. But Momentum became frightened of its own shadow. It spent all its time organising kind of workshops on how to canvass for right-wing Labour candidates in elections. And, you know, we went to one of those early on. And we took a couple of young people, and they were so bored out of their skulls. They during a tea break, they refused to stay in the meeting. They said, we support Jeremy's politics. We're not interested in all this business about, you know, how to canvass for a right-wing MP. Why should we canvass for a right-wing MP? So that was an episode. That episode we have to learn from.
Yeah.
And we now have to build, you know, new left forces. And like I said earlier, the Trade Unionist and Socialist coalition doesn't purport to be the new mass workers' party. We want the unions to break with New Labour, but it's a step in that direction that we're engaged in that dialogue, because workers expect and demand better. We can't carry on making the same mistake. The last thing I would say is that, you know, there are a number of good people still in local Labour parties who can't bring themselves to resign even now, who hope against hope that Jeremy is going to come back. They have no idea how that might be possible. Let's put it this way, the right wing won't make that same mistake twice in putting him on the back paper. But, you know, I respect that each person has their own journey. And I'm in dialogue with a lot of Labour Party members across the southwest of England. And I always say the same thing to them, which is that, you know, whilst I respect the fact that they don't feel able to leave the Labour Party yet, they have to ask themselves honestly what they are doing in the Labour Party that is making a difference in terms of building the left.
Yeah.
And one of the people that you might even have been at the meeting, Tom, but one of the people who attended a regional meeting of ours recently online said to us, there's no way I'm leaving the Labour Party. It's my party, and they're not going to force me out. The following week, she was suspended from the Labour Party for complaining about the way that Jeremy Corbyn was being treated. And the week after that, she joined the Socialist Party. So for some people, you know, the actions of Starmer will be the catalyst in bringing them to us. But we would say to those people, learn the lessons, don't forget what went wrong, but let's now move on, because there's a more important project than just a kind of abstract peace and justice project. There's a project to actually build socialism, and that must be rooted in working class communities, because Labour is viewed cynically by a lot of working people now. It's seen as being a kind of London-based party of professional types in suits and power dressing, and, you know, workers think, well, these
Career
people don't speak our language. And what we've got to do, and it is the ethos of everything I've been saying really, is real socialists have to go where the workers are. In his very famous work, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, Vladimir Lenin used that exact phrase. Marxists go where the workers are. And we go there not as kind of, preachers who come in from the outside to teach workers. We come in as fellow workers. The only difference between me and millions of people who aren't listening to your excellent blog tonight is that, people will have in the future may join a socialist movement. I joined at an earlier stage. That doesn't make me special. That doesn't make me more intelligent. It simply means that, I drew the conclusions that many others are drawing now a long while ago. And so it's incumbent on people like me, to ensure that passion that I had for wanting to fight for a better world is bequeathed to this new generation of people. I've great confidence in young people today, because they're constantly being put down by the system. They're constantly being blamed for spreading coronavirus by going to illegal raves and all this stuff. The truth is, the young people I meet are really, really connected to politics, only they don't use that word. If you say to them, what about politics? They say, no, I'm not interested. But you actually talk about the issues of climate change, of racism, Black Lives Matter, and they're really, really engaged generation. What they need to stay engaged and what they need and deserve is, political ideas that can actually map a route to victory. Because we don't want to be, I won't be here in 60 years' time, but we don't want to be having this discussion again 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line and saying, we didn't win this time. What can we do next time? We've got to forge the energy of young people who want to make change to ideas that can make that change. And then we shall be unconquerable.
I think, building on that, I think one of the challenges, I guess, for a lot of people, especially as you've mentioned a lot, is that there just is no other alternative that we can see right now. Like there isn't that leadership that we need to show the people that, like, hey, socialism isn't this scary big thing off in the corner that goes against everything we're told is right in the world. Socialism is the most reasonable explanation. And support for the Democrats in the US, for example, the Liberals or NDP in Canada, Labour in the UK, seems largely to be justified by being the lesser of two evils, more so than any sort of ideological connection. At least Trump still isn't in power, seems to be something that I see a lot on social media, and it's usually in response to some sort of critique of the Biden government, for example. My issue with this is that it's just letting the conservatives and the capitalists define what we allow as permissible in society each day. I read a quote online by a US socialist, Peter Camejo, who joked, if they wanted us to vote for Mussolini, they need only put him up against Hitler. And I think it's this sense of lesser evilism which seems to be stopping us from imagining how good our world could be, how just it could be, if we just followed a completely independent program like socialism. But for a lot of people, they see socialism as too much of a risk, too far outside the comfort zone. And, so meaningful change is hard to come by. We see AOC and the Squad in the US politics saying they can't possibly push their socialist agenda because it's too far away from what we're so used to, like we just have to filibuster right now. We can't possibly, do all these progressive policies that people are asking for and desire, but it's because of that lack of leadership and that lack of maybe willingness to risk their political careers or willingness to, go against this huge, big power struggle between billionaires and the government that we're seeing.
I think you're absolutely right, Stuart. I agree with everything you've said. And I'll give you an anecdote which I think sums up, the US situation quite well. 4 years ago, I was doing a debate at a university with a number of people who were arguing that Trump was going to be a fantastic president, and I was opposing that motion, obviously. But one of the guys I was debating with was a member of the Republican Party Young Members National Committee. He was studying at Exeter University, so he was quite high up in the Republican Party. And we didn't have a lot in common. We didn't agree. But afterwards, as sometimes is inevitably the case, you stop and have a drink and chat, because I never like leaving those kinds of debates straight away, because it makes my opponents think they frighten me away. You know, I always make sure I'm there until the end arguing.
Look them in the eye.
But yeah, exactly. But this guy came up to me and he said, you know, that his family were from Kansas and they were Republicans. But he said, had Bernie Sanders been the candidate, his family would seriously have considered switching their vote to Bernie Sanders, because they liked what he said about jobs and they liked what he said about, you know, speaking up for ordinary people. And this was a guy from the Republican Party talking to me. So I think, you know, Biden, unfortunately, you know, has a track record going back decades of not only being a Democrat compromiser, but a hardline Democrat who in the 1960s actually, you know, gave passive support to segregationists in the South. Biden is not going to be the magic man who retransforms America. What Biden will do over the next 4 years, even with a nominal majority in the Senate, is enormously disappoint the American electorate, and Trumpism, in one form or another, will continue to strengthen. And whether in 4 years' time Donald Trump or Donald Trump Jr. or Ivanka Trump or one of the people cut from that cloth stand for president, then we could find ourselves, you know, once again with a right-wing Republican leader. And, you know, I've spent all my life hearing leftist reformists. And of course, the Democratic Party isn't a socialist party in the way that the European social democracies are at all. It's a big business party. But I've spent all my life hearing left-wing reformists say, we mustn't criticize now because we have to win the next election. And then if they win that election, their narrative changes to, we mustn't criticize now because we're in power and we have to be loyal. And people like AOC, as you mentioned, are, you know, doing no service to the cause of socialism, if indeed she considers herself really to be a socialist, by staying quiet. And it's a tragedy that 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders, when he was outmaneuvered for the Democratic nomination, didn't stand as an independent socialist. You know, opinion polls in the US tell us that 50% of young people in the US, when asked the question of whether they think socialism or capitalism is a better system, say that they think socialism is a better system. Now, they don't have a clearly defined view necessarily, and they may be in lots of cases just responding to Trumpism and capitalism as manifested over the last 4 years. But that could be such an important building block to start from, you know, to take socialism down into the working class. And another example, 3 years ago, teachers in West Virginia went on strike. Now, West Virginia has the reputation of being a redneck state, a Trumpite state, and so on. Our co-thinkers in the US, because we are an international organization in Canada as well, but our co-thinkers in the US went down to West Virginia to intervene on the picket lines. And they got a very frosty reception on the first day, because many of these men and women on the picket line were wearing Trump badges and they were wearing Trump hats. And yet there they were on a picket line demonstrating against the Republicans in West Virginia who had cut teachers' wages and conditions. But through patient engagement with these teachers, within 48 hours, they were saying to us, well, you guys are amazing. You call yourself socialist, but you actually sound like us. How can you be socialist? And we were saying, well, what did you think socialists look like? And so we began to break down barriers. And in fact, we actually recruited one of those teachers from being a Republican supporter over to becoming a socialist. And I think that, you know, the same is true, as you rightly say, with the NDP. I remember back in the 1980s, you know, hearing about, you know, the left in the NDP and the challenge that they were offering. But all of these parties have capitulated to the market in the last 20 years. They've all, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a decisive moment, they've kind of accepted the George Bush Sr. narrative that communism is dead, the market has triumphed. You know, it was ludicrous in 1990. You had the historian Francis Fukuyama saying it's the end of history. So you could ever reach the end of history. You had George Bush saying, you know, America is now the super unipolar power. You know, we can do whatever we like. We pointed out, actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, you know, took place for reasons we don't have time to go into tonight. And we were never defenders of the, you know, one-party rule and the dictatorial approach that characterized the Soviet Union. But we pointed out that actually this would open up a new period of frenetic competition between the superpowers, that America was inexorably becoming weakened compared to the position it had enjoyed in 1945. And that in countries like, you know, Canada, you know, the NDP tail-ended this process of moving and shifting away from being prepared to argue for socialism towards trying to find a third way, a middle ground, if you like. And there is no middle ground, as I said before. And you saw some spectacular disappearances. In Italy, the Socialist Party collapsed and completely disappeared. In Spain, the Socialist Party is in government, yet they're not socialist in any way. They're a party which has carried through neoliberal policies and actually joined in the attacks on the Catalan people when they sought, you know, the right of self-determination, as sadly did Podemos, the sort of left party in Spain. One of the things that actually has characterized the emergence of new left parties in the last 20 years has been how quickly they've gone from espousing so-called socialist ideas to actually capitulate into the market. So whether you talk about, you know, the left party, or going further back, you know, the party in Brazil under Lula's presidency, or whether you look at Podemos or Syriza, all these parties which, you know, attracted young people and started off by saying that they wanted to be different from the old hierarchical parties. They wanted to be horizontal parties and practice primitive democracy. That was all a nonsense, because what happened is, because they didn't have local cells and local branches and so on, the decisions were still being made by leaders who then effectively put those decisions out to plebiscite. But, you know, knowing that most members wouldn't vote in those plebiscites. So, like I said before, it's not the idea of the party that's wrong. It's what kind of party it is and what ideas it's based upon. And, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think in 4 years' time in America, Biden's name is going to be dirt. And, you know, Trumpism has not been vanquished. You know, Trump will not be prosecuted by the Senate. The impeachment will fail. In 4 years' time, you know, he might have croaked, so he may not be on the scene. But his son will stand. And Don Trump Jr. is just as nasty a piece of work. And there's a whole group of them now, you know. So the far right are also a threat. We haven't talked about them tonight. But, you know, the other danger of there being a vacuum where the left once stood is that workers can be seduced into far-right politics, because the easiest thing in the world is to point someone with a different colour skin or someone who speaks a different language and say they are the problem. Scapegoatism has always been one of the features of capitalist class society. You know, turn workers away from looking above at the puppet masters who control us, towards looking to the side at the person who's got a
divide and conquer.
Skin. Exactly. And you know, we've had a huge lesson in that in the UK in terms of Northern Ireland, and we see it across the world. You know, in every country where British imperialism had its bloody fingers, you know, they ruled through divide and conquer, the breaking up of the Indian subcontinent, the creation of Pakistan, the Middle East, Iraq, and so on. So again, capitalism in this era is running out of steam, but that doesn't mean that it's going to fall by the wayside. It has to be overthrown. And when I say overthrown, that has to be through the building of mass movements of millions in every country. So the Socialist Party is part of an international organization, the Committee for a Workers International, and we organize everywhere from, Israel, Palestine, to the United States, to Chile, to Brazil, Malaysia. We have, a very, very small base in Canada at the moment, but we're confident we can grow. And in Europe, we're strong in France, in Germany, in Ireland, and so on. And the issues in different countries will be slightly different at different times, obviously. But the methodology with which we pursue our politics is the same. We go where the workers are. We intervene on the picket lines in the communities where they're struggling against the closure of a service, to protect services against privatization, to set up organizations that can reach out to young people who are being exploited by zero-hour contracts, and who don't have support from official trade unions that seem to think it's too much of a bother to organize young people. One of our members in Plymouth, England, has become, about 2 years ago, became a zero-hour contract worker working for a computer game company. 15 people in his workplace, all really badly exploited, all on zero-hour contracts. One of them was subject to sexual harassment by, the boss. So what did our comrade do? He got the workforce together on a Sunday lunchtime in a local pub, away from the prying eyes of their management. He gave them all union cards. He then went to the union. He had to really find them, because they didn't meet in Plymouth. They met in some obscure little village. And when he walked in, this guy of 27, they're like, "How did you find us? Who are you? What do you want?" He's like, "I want to join the union. And by the way, here's another 15 people who want to join." Well, he's now completely transformed that workplace. They've got really good conditions. They've got a strong union. And he's standing currently for a national executive position in that union to cover the southwest of England. There's a fair chance he will win. And we've taken his campaign into every supermarket that has union members in it. It's been very difficult in the lockdown to leaflet supermarkets, and as you can imagine. But we've taken the campaign in, and we hear on the grapevine that the right-wing leaders of that union are so petrified about Ryan maybe getting elected that they're putting all their efforts, even though there are elections for the whole country, they're putting all their efforts into trying to stop him getting elected in Plymouth. Now, Leon Trotsky famously said that, if you have, in 1917, one Bolshevik in a regiment, then you can win over that regiment to the revolution. And it's the same with the workplaces. We have a conference this Saturday of the National Shop Stewards Network, which is a rank and file body of trade unionists. And we are, trying to build that one socialist in a factory, one socialist in an office, one socialist in a, hospital or whatever. And given the period we're in and all the issues and questions that are being raised by workers, that one person in the workplace can be the catalyst in winning somebody else, and then a third person, then a fourth person. And, that's the position our party take. I mean, we roll up our sleeves, we get stuck in, and we go where the workers are. I mean, it's crazy, really, that Tom and I still haven't met because of the lockdowns in Britain. I feel,
I'm sure that we will.
Yeah. I mean, but there's no place in England where we can set up a stall and sell our newspaper. The last time we went to Salisbury, which is a city which isn't noted for its revolutionary militancy, we sold 25 papers in the morning in Salisbury, and got donations totaling, I think, another sort of £20. And people were coming up to us, and not necessarily all saying, I'm a socialist, but they were coming up to us and saying, it's really good to see you campaigning against the threat to close local hospitals. And so you begin to make that connection on that level. And then you draw it out into a wider discussion about, well, it's not just the hospital we want to save. We want publicly run hospitals. We want workers' control and management. We want an end to obscenely high rents in the housing sector. And then you say, but to get all that, we need to change society. And the next step is maybe for you to join us and get involved and then to begin organically to build the forces. We have people who say to us, socialism frightens me, I'm put off by the concept.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to recruit all of those people at this stage, but what we have to do is try very simply to deconstruct the word and turn it into aspirations, turn it into things that make a difference to people's lives. That's why we don't, call ourselves communists. Marx and Engels called themselves communists. Unfortunately, the word communist was used and besmirched by capitalist class and the media. But we are genuine communists, genuine Marxists. But the word socialist is an easier bridge to cross.
A bit more digestible for people.
It is. It is.
So that's great. That's important, because that's what we try. What you've just said there is what we try to do with this podcast. Basically, it's about reaching out to people, having informed and respectful discourse, which is something. It's one of the reasons why we set up the podcast. In response to one of the elections that was going through, where you just have one side on the right and one side on the left, and they're just throwing crap at each other, and no one's listening to each other. So it's about reaching out, being that ripple, Stu, which was my word for last year, and making common ground, which is my word for this year. So that is amazing, Robin. I realise we're taking up a lot of your time, and we can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast and sharing with us all your stories, all your personal stories, the insight that you have into socialism and Marxism, and for breaking that down for people. I hope people really get something out of listening to this episode. If people want to get in touch with you, the Socialist Party or anything like that, where can they find you?
They can contact us on our website, which is www.socialistparty.org.uk. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the best way to reach us. And if anyone has thought about any questions they have specifically based on what I've said, my phone number is on that website and they can contact me directly. But I'm sure most people won't want to take up an international phone bill by doing that. But it's been a pleasure, and like I said at the beginning, I could talk for 5 hours, but that wouldn't be reasonable. I think as I've got older, I'm 65 this year, and I've been working for the Socialist Party since I was 22. It's not a job you do for the financial rewards, as you can appreciate, but I have never regretted a single moment of how I have spent and will continue to spend my life, because perhaps the last thing I'll leave you with is the idea that my brain rebels at the thought that this is the best the world is ever capable of being. That this is the best that human beings are ever capable of achieving. If I thought that, I really would pack it in tomorrow morning, because that would be an extremely depressing thought. I think what the coronavirus has illustrated is the ludicrous nature of the world we live in today, the vast inequalities that are not just permitted but encouraged by the system, and the fact that there is an alternative. And in any stage of history, when human beings have been fighting against oppression, there will have been many times when they looked around and thought, will it ever change? Can it ever change? The people who led the struggle to overthrow feudalism, the people who fought against American imperialism in Vietnam, the people who are, fighting for national liberation or recognition of their rights, the heroic youth who are on the streets of Myanmar at the present time, standing up to the army, people in Hong Kong who are going on to demonstrations, young people with their wills written in their pockets because they expect they could be shot on those demonstrations. Human beings have a great capacity to struggle. Thankfully, as a species, when we face oppression, we don't resort to mass suicide. We struggle. And struggle is the locomotive for all change. And the most successful struggle is the struggle where you have a clear program and clear objectives and confidence in the working class. But also, you have to have that determination. You have to recognize that there are pitfalls along the road, that you won't win victories on every occasion you go into battle. But really, each skirmish we engage in, creates that ripple, Tom. And that ripple, becomes greater and greater. And therefore, I've never been more confident in the capacity of ordinary people to struggle. I think a new generation are coming onto the political stage. They're not prepared to put up with the bullshit spouted by men in, grey suits, usually men, sometimes women as well, of course. They all wear grey suits as well. But they, those politicians, they have besmirched the reputation of politics. And for me, politics is not about men and women or people of other genders arguing in national parliaments about things that don't concern us in our day-to-day lives. Politics is about jobs, is about homes, is about a decent future, education, even decent pensions, something more on my mind these days than would have been the case when I started out. And that's what politics is. And it's socialists can be the glue that help make the connections between all those disparate issues and the confidence to engage and fight for something better. Like I say, if I thought that we didn't have the capacity to build a better world, it would be a depressing time. But I'm utterly convinced we can. I'm utterly convinced we will. And, tomorrow morning, I'll be no doubt answering emails from people who've applied to join the Socialist Party today. I'll be talking to some of them on the phone at less length than I've talked tonight, because otherwise they'll be complaining that their phone bill has got too high. But, we never stop talking. And sometimes we can win over the most unlikely people. I refuse to think that all those people who voted Trump in America, for instance, are neo-fascists or conspiracy theorists. Yeah. Many of them are just downtrodden working class people who have been sold the same kind of lie that, people in America have always been told. You had in the 19th century the snake oil salesman who turned up in the old western town and said, drink this and it will make your hair grow, or it will make you more virile, or it will make your land more fertile. There have always been those people. And people in hopeless situations grasp at desperate solutions. But we'll go after working class people in America, in Canada, in Europe, across the world, in Asia. There is no no-go area for socialism. The only limit is the limit of, our numbers. And that's why we obviously, urge people not just to listen to a podcast, but to become engaged, whether as a Socialist Party member or in a different capacity fighting for socialism. That isn't ultimately the most important thing. We don't claim we're the only pure socialists on the planet. Of course not. We want to meet, and we do regularly meet groups of people who contact us and say, we want to get involved and how can we collaborate and so on. So we have to take back the common cause of humanity, which is that of creating a better world, a world fit for the 21st century. And I think, I hope tonight that people listening will really feel that, maybe it's a time now for them to take a small baby step towards getting involved in some capacity. Many will be involved already, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But those who work, don't be scared, in the water.
And that it's possible as well, and that there is, there's things to be positive about, like the youth movement and things that you said, and that I take part in the fact that all the rights that we enjoy have all come about from working class agitation and things like that. And so I hope that people have enjoyed this episode tonight. If you can, if you did and you want to get in touch, Stu, do you want to tell them where to get?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have any questions for us or Robin at all, it's hi@tomstewandyou.com. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. It's just @tomstewandyou. Robin, this has been an absolutely incredible episode. Your passion and your extensive knowledge on all things socialism and the common good has truly astounded me, that's for sure. This is by far our most comprehensive socialism-based episode, but I know Tom has a bazillion more questions and I have plenty more as well. So we really do hope that you'll come back on the podcast at some point in the future because I think you have so much to share, and we truly do appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I'd be very happy to come back on or to assist in any way. And, I don't claim to be the font of all knowledge, but what I do claim is I'll always listen, and I'll always have something to say. And hopefully it will be positive and constructive. So it's been a pleasure for me, real pleasure. And, thanks very much for thinking about inviting me on and giving me this opportunity to talk about my socialist journey, which hopefully will strike a chord with a few other people, either just beginning their socialist journey or a few grizzled old veterans like me who've been on their own journey. But ultimately, I may never meet you. We may be in different corners of the world. We're all marching in the same direction. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Robin. We appreciate your time so much. And until next time, everyone, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.